This is the sixth recording on Strunk and White for your midterm exam, Thursday, October 21st. I'm going to talk a little bit about grammar and changes in grammar. There's been very few changes in the last 100 years. So one change is putting a preposition at the end of a sentence. You now may put a preposition at the end of a sentence. Guess I have a sun shadow on me. Sorry. Anyway, so White says on page, and I have to look that up, 77, that things have changed. You'd think I would have marked my pages, but I didn't. So at the bottom of 77, he says, years ago, and he's writing in 1957, students were warned not to end a sentence with a preposition. Time, of course, has softened that rigid decree. Not only is the preposition acceptable at the end, sometimes it is more effective in that spot than anywhere else. So that rule has been changed. When my mother went to school, she was told all the time not to end a sentence with a preposition, but she knew that that rule had also been changed. So she used to scold my brother and I by making fun of the rule, and I guess at the same time teaching us English, by saying, when we were bad, by saying, that is something up with which I will not put. Now, the reason that sentence sounds so awkward is because she didn't put a preposition at the end. So that rule has changed. And I've nagged you about that slightly. Another rule I've nagged you about is using cliches. And that rule hasn't really changed, but what White did was something creative, which you're welcome to do. At the end of his introduction on Roman numeral 18, he says at the very end, I still find the Strunkian wisdom a comfort, the Strunkian humor a delight, and the Strunkian attitude towards right and wrong a blessing undisguised. So he took a cliche and turned it around. So imagine that you had to go somewhere and you were late and the freeway was bumper to bumper. And you finally get there and you discover that the building where you had to have the meeting was permanently closed for some reason that you didn't know about. So you weren't late to your meeting. That was a blessing in disguise. That's the cliche. So he turned it around saying a blessing undisguised. Strunk is so wonderful. He's a blessing. And you can obviously see it. So that's use of cliches. Another thing I've been nagging you about a lot is the use of abbreviations. So if you go to the first page of Engel's forward, that's Roman numeral 9, we'll have an example of that. By the way, I've forgotten to tell you about Roger Engel. He's actually still alive, unlike Strunk and White. He's in his 90s, and he wrote for the New Yorker, but he also is an expert on baseball. He was actually inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. So that's something interesting. Probably more interesting than grammar. Anyway, this is what Engel says about White. Each Tuesday morning, White would close his study door and sit down to write the notes and comment page for the New Yorker. The task was familiar to him. He was required to file a few hundred words of editorial or personal commentary on some topic. The sounds of his typewriter from his room came in hesitant bursts, with long silences in between. Hours went by. Summoned at last for lunch, he was silent and preoccupied and soon excused himself to go back to the job. When the copy went off at last, in the afternoon RFD pouch, we were in Maine, a day's mail away from New York, he rarely seemed satisfied. It isn't good enough, he said sometimes. I wish it were better. Now, what the heck is RFD? Yeah, you could Google it, but why should you have to? We shouldn't be using abbreviations that people won't know in our writing. RFD, he had context clues there. He said, RFD pouch, we were in Maine, a day's mail away from New York. But couldn't he have just said mail pouch? RFD stands for Rule-Free Delivery. During Franklin Roosevelt's administration, he had a law passed that said that everybody would get mail delivered to them. Before that, it was only people in cities. And people that lived out in the country had to go into town to get their mail. So you probably have some of those reruns on television about mail delivery to Alaska that's dropped by airplane or helicopter. That's because of rule-free delivery. Hate the sun today. So anyway, RFD, rule-free delivery. So this is a reason not to use abbreviations, because when Roger Engel wrote that, people probably understood that abbreviation, but we don't. I mean, I do, because I'll look it up for you. But so remember, abbreviations in academic writing should be written out, and then in parentheses, the abbreviation. And then when you're writing something like a foreword or introduction, don't use abbreviations. Just simplify it for the reader. Okay, the last thing I want to cover is an important rule that I've been nagging you about, is forming possessives. That rule has changed dramatically. And on this page that you're watching the video on, I put the new rule. If you form the possessive in the old way, that's fine. Still an A+ for forming possessives. But if you are forming your possessives wrong and not doing it correctly, then try the new rule. So here we have on Roman numeral 17 in the introduction. White writes, some years ago, when the heir to the throne of England was a child, I noticed a headline in the Times about Bonnie Prince Charlie. Charles's tonsils out. Immediately Rule 1 leapt to mind. Now, we don't know whether this is the New York Times or the London Times. It doesn't matter, but do you see how it would have been helpful if he'd written either New York or London there? So then he quotes the rule, which is out of date. It's not wrong, but out of date. So let's turn to page 1 in your book. Rule 1, page 1. Form the possessive singular of nouns by adding apostrophe s. This rule has changed. Follow this rule whatever the final consonant. Thus write Charles's friend. And the reason I'm blurring that is because the more up-to-date rule would just add an apostrophe and not an extra s. And you'll see on the examples that I'm going to give below some other changes that rule affects. Like bosses doesn't have a bunch of s's after it. It doesn't read bosses. And Burns's poems. We just use the apostrophe s. So the rule has changed since Strunk's time. So if you're keeping your beloved Strunk and White, as I do, draw a line under Burns's poems, because everything below is still correct. He says, follow this rule with whatever the final consonant. So he knew already when he wrote this around 1919 that this rule was changing. Because now we look at the last letter in the word to determine how we're going to form the possessive. So that's another change. Otherwise, as you read through the book, can you find other changes? You're not going to find many, I'll tell you, because I think I've found them all, but I could be wrong. I've made errors before, once or twice. So let me check my notes that I've covered everything I have that I want to cover in this video. So, any questions? I love the sun. Any questions, email me, and I'll see you in the next video.